A woman stood up from the audience. She said, "Johnny Carson." And America's most composed host completely broke down. It was March 1973. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank, California. Another Thursday night. Another monologue. Another audience of 300 people settling in for laughs and celebrity interviews and the comforting rhythm of late-night television. Johnny was mid-joke. Something about politics. The audience was laughing on cue. Ed McMahon was chuckling from his seat beside the desk. Doc Severinsen and the band were ready for the musical cue. Everything was running exactly as it should. And then a voice came from the audience. Middle rows. A woman's voice. Quiet but clear enough to cut through the laughter. "Johnny Carson." Not a shout. Not a question. Just his name. Said with a weight that made everyone in the studio turn to look. Johnny stopped mid-sentence. The smile froze on his face. His hands, which had been gesturing through the punchline, lowered slowly to grip the edge of his desk. The woman was standing now. Late 40s. Short dark hair. Simple dress. She wasn't trying to disrupt the show. She was standing because she had to. Because sitting had become impossible. Johnny stared at her. The audience fell silent, confused. Ed McMahon leaned forward, concerned. The cameras stayed locked on Johnny's face as every trace of his professional composure drained away. "Ma'am," Johnny said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do I know you?" The woman's hands were shaking. "You don't remember me, Mr. Carson. But I remember you. Saigon. December 1967. The field hospital near Tan Son Hut." Johnny's face went white. Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. The control room erupted. Director Bobby Quinn was shouting into his headset. "What's happening? Who is that woman? Do we cut? Do we go to commercial?" Producer Fred DeCordova stood frozen behind Bobby, staring at the monitors, watching Johnny Carson, who never lost control, who never showed weakness, gripping his desk like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Keep rolling," Fred said quietly. "Don't you dare cut away." On stage, Johnny hadn't moved. He was staring at the standing woman like she was a ghost. And in a way, she was. A ghost from a past he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. "Sit down," someone in the audience whispered to the woman. "You're disrupting." "No." Johnny's voice cut through the studio, sharp and commanding. "Let her speak. Please." The woman took a shaky breath. "My name is Margaret Walsh. I was a nurse. Army Nurse Corps. I served 3 tours in Vietnam. And you..." Her voice broke. "You saved my life." Ed McMahon's hand went to his mouth. The audience was completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something that transcended television. Johnny shook his head slowly. "I didn't. I wasn't in Vietnam. I never served in." "December 15th, 1967. Margaret interrupted, her voice stronger now. "You came to visit the wounded. USO tour. You spent 6 hours in our hospital. Do you remember?" Johnny's jaw clenched. His eyes closed briefly. When he opened them, they were glistening. "I remember," he whispered. "To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in December 1967. Johnny Carson was already the king of late-night television by then. The Tonight Show was the most watched program in its time slot. Johnny was famous, beloved, successful beyond measure. He could have spent his holidays anywhere. Instead, he spent Christmas 1967 in Vietnam. Not for publicity. Not for ratings. He'd insisted on minimal press coverage. This wasn't a show. It was something else. Something he felt compelled to do. The USO had organized visits to safer areas. Performance halls, established bases where soldiers could gather for entertainment. But Johnny had made a specific request: take me to the field hospitals. Take me to where the wounded are. the ones who can't come to a show. They'd warned him. Field hospitals weren't sanitized. They were brutal, honest places where young men and women fought to save lives under impossible conditions. The sights, the sounds, the smells, they would stay with him forever. Johnny said he understood. He went anyway. The 24th Evacuation Hospital near Tan Son Nhut Air Base was operating at triple capacity when Johnny arrived. Casualties from recent operations filled every bed, every hallway, every available space. Nurses worked 18-hour shifts trying to keep shattered young men alive long enough to get them home. Margaret Walsh had been on duty for 22 straight hours when someone told her Johnny Carson was in the building. She was in the ICU, tending to a 19-year-old Marine from Iowa who'd lost both legs and was calling for his mother in his morphine haze. She didn't have time for celebrities. She had 17 critical patients and 3 other nurses to coordinate. She barely acknowledged the information. But then Johnny walked into the ICU. Not with cameras. Not with an entourage. Just him and one military escort. He was wearing simple clothes, no suit, no performance costume. He looked tired and overwhelmed and like he was trying very hard not to show how horrified he was by what he was seeing. He went to the first bed. A soldier missing an arm, unconscious, bandaged head to toe. Johnny stood there for a long moment, just looking at this kid who was younger than his own son. Then he pulled up a chair and sat down. The nurse attending that bed, a young woman named Kelly, started to tell him that the patient couldn't hear him, was heavily sedated. Johnny nodded and sat anyway. "I'm just going to sit here for a while," he said quietly. "If that's okay." He sat for 20 minutes. Silent. Just sitting with this unconscious soldier. Being present. Then he moved to the next bed. And the next. For 6 hours, Johnny Carson moved through that field hospital, sitting with soldiers who were dying, holding hands of kids who were crying, writing down messages for families, listening to stories, making no jokes, offering no performance. Just being human with other humans in hell. Margaret Walsh noticed him after the first hour. She was moving between patients, administering medications, checking vitals, trying to keep people alive. And there was Johnny Carson, sitting beside a corporal from Tennessee who was on a ventilator, holding the kid's hand and talking to him quietly even though the soldier couldn't respond. "He probably can't hear you," Margaret said as she checked the soldiers for. "Probably," Johnny agreed. "But maybe he can. And either way, he shouldn't be alone." Margaret had been in Vietnam for 18 months. She'd seen thousands of wounded. She'd held the hands of boys as they died. She'd written letters to mothers explaining how their sons' last moments went. She'd stopped crying months ago because there were too many tears and not enough time. But something about watching this famous man, this person who lived in a different world, a world of laughter and applause and comfort, choosing to sit in this hell and be present broke something open in her chest. Later that night, as Johnny was preparing to leave, the hospital took a direct mortar hit. Not close enough to breach the building, but close enough to shake the walls, shatter windows, knock out power. Emergency generators kicked in immediately, but for 30 seconds the ICU was in complete darkness filled with the sounds of explosions, alarms, and patients crying out in fear. Margaret was in the middle of changing a dressing when the lights went out. She froze, hands still on the soldier's wound, trying to orient herself in the dark. She'd been through attacks before. She knew the protocol. Stay calm. Stay with your patient. Wait for the generators. But this time, something was different. This time, her hands started shaking. This time, 18 months of held-together composure began to crack. The lights came back on. Johnny Carson was standing 3 feet away, his face pale, his eyes wide. He dropped to the floor during the explosion, survival instinct, and was now slowly standing up, looking around at the chaos. His eyes met Margaret's. And he saw it. The fear. The exhaustion. The breaking point. He walked over to her. "Are you okay?" Margaret opened her mouth to say yes, of course, she was fine, she was always fine. But what came out instead was a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know anymore." Johnny didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and hugged her. Right there in the ICU. This stranger. This celebrity. This person from a different world wrapped his arms around a woman who hadn't been hugged in a year and a half and let her cry into his shoulder, while mortar fire echoed in the distance. He didn't say anything. Didn't try to fix it. Just held her while she shook. When Margaret finally pulled back, embarrassed, trying to compose herself, Johnny kept one hand on her shoulder. "What you doing here?" he said quietly. "What all of you are doing, it matters more than anything I've ever done. More than any show, any joke, any applause. You're saving lives. You're being present for these kids when they need someone most. That's everything." Margaret wiped her eyes. "I don't feel like I'm doing enough. You're doing more than enough. You're here. That's everything. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead." Margaret never forgot that moment. That hug. Those words. They sustained her through the rest of her tour. Through 2 more tours. Through the years after Vietnam, when she came home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war, didn't want to acknowledge what she'd seen or done. She never tried to contact Johnny Carson. What would she say? How do you thank someone for a moment that saved your life in ways they couldn't possibly understand? But she watched The Tonight Show. Every night that she could. And seeing Johnny make people laugh, seeing him be kind to his guests, seeing him navigate the world with grace and humor, it reminded her that goodness existed. That the same person who had held her while she cried in a field hospital could still find joy and create joy for others. 5 years later, in March 1973, Margaret's daughter won tickets to The Tonight Show through a radio contest. Margaret almost didn't go. She moved on from Vietnam, or so she told herself. She was working at a civilian hospital now, building a normal life. But her daughter insisted. "It'll be fun, Mom. When's the last time you did something fun?" So Margaret went. She sat in the audience. She laughed at Johnny's monologue. She thought maybe she'd made a mistake, maybe it was better to just let that moment in Vietnam stay in the past. And then, in the middle of a joke about Nixon, something shifted. Johnny's voice, the way he paused, the specific way he was standing. It was exactly how he'd stood in that ICU 5 years ago. Before he'd hugged her. Before he'd told her she mattered. The memory crashed over her with physical force. Suddenly she was back in Saigon. Back in that moment when someone had seen her, really seen her, and reminded her that she was human. She stood up. She didn't plan to. Her body just moved. Johnny Carson. And now, 5 years later, in Studio 6B in Burbank, California, Johnny Carson was gripping his desk and staring at this woman who had just unlocked a door he'd kept sealed shut since 1967. Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. "Come here," Johnny said to Margaret, his voice rough. "Please, come up here." The audience members between Margaret and the stage stepped back, creating a path. She walked slowly down the aisle, up the steps to the stage. Johnny stood up from behind his desk for the first time in the show's history during a monologue. They met center stage. Johnny looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with tears. "I never forgot that night," he said quietly. "I've never talked about it. But I never forgot any of you. You told me I mattered," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "When I needed to hear it most. And I've needed to tell you, you saved me that night. Not the soldiers. Me." Johnny pulled her into a hug. The same hug from 1967. The studio audience rose to their feet, applauding through tears. Ed McMahon was openly crying. Doc's orchestra began playing softly, something gentle and reverent. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Johnny gave Margaret his cue card from that night. He'd written on the back, Margaret Walsh, Saigon, December 15, 1967. Never forget. He'd been carrying her name in his desk for 5 years. That cue card hangs in the Vietnam Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. today. Next to it, a plaque reads, "When someone sees you, really sees you, they save your life."